Over 25 years ago, Joseph Pearce was a radical agnostic activist. In fact, Mr. Pearce had been imprisoned twice for hate-filled articles in national extremist magazines. Through grace and no doubt the power of beauty, Mr. Pearce went from angry agnosticism to joyful Catholicism. Today, this English-born author has several critically acclaimed best-selling biographies of great 19th and 20th century Christian authors. Mr. Pearce's works include Chesterton's Wisdom and Innocent, Literary Converts, Tolkien, Man and Myth, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile, The Quest for Shakespeare, Old Thunder, A Life of Hilaire Belloc. He is also the co-founder and co-editor of the St. Austin Review, an international magazine of Catholic culture, art, and literature. He is also the series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions. Joseph Pearce has held various positions on Catholic universities from across America. Some of you here were his students. And he has also hosted 2 television series for EWTN on the case for Shakespeare's Catholicism. On behalf of St. John Cantius Parish and on behalf of the Catholic Art Guild, I am pleased to welcome Joseph Pearce for his presentation, The Evangelizing Power of Beauty, Converting the Culture. Joseph Pearce.
Good morning, everybody. Well, the first thing I just want to express not just my gratitude for this invitation, because that would not really be adequate, because I've actually had a great desire to visit the famous St. John Cantius Church for about 15 years, and I've been wondering why it's taken so long for them to invite me. But it's happened, and I'm delighted that it's happened. And once I was giving a talk somewhere in Chicago, and we drove past the front of the church. Oh, well, that's St. John Cantius. It is? Bye. And that was about 8 years ago, and so I've been waiting impatiently to come here. And I got to experience the liturgy last night and this morning, well, just to experience the beauty of the church. I would say one other thing as well is my life is, I do a lot of traveling, giving talks, and the spectrum that I experience, because I gave a retreat somewhere at a parish in the west coast that will remain nameless, in case somebody here knows somebody there. I don't want this going back to them. As I pulled up outside that church, I thought, this has to be the ugliest Catholic church I've ever seen anywhere, ever. And that's saying something, actually, because my local parish in South Carolina, the Prince of Peace, which also offers the traditional Mass at noon every Sunday, diocesan parish, the original church building, built in the 1970s, looks like a washing machine agitator. Some people who are more charitable than me call it a spaceship, but I think washing machine agitator is more accurate. Thankfully, that became too small to be practical, and now they built a whole new church, which is much more edifying. But I thought that my own parish had the claim to the ugliest church in the United States, but I've seen one that's uglier. And then that was about 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and to go from there to this, which was voted recently the most beautiful church in the United States, just shows the sort of up and down in my life. Okay, I'm going to plan to speak for about 45 minutes on the evangelizing power of beauty, and then I'd invite questions, so please be thinking of questions so we can have a lively Q&A session at the end of the talk. So the evangelizing power of beauty. The first thing is we have to realize, and I don't think St. John Cantius parishioners need to be told this, that evangelism is not an option. Because the 2 great commandments of Christ are that we love the Lord our God and that we love our neighbour. And we can't love our God without loving our neighbour, which means we can't get to heaven without loving our neighbour, which means we have to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to our neighbours, and indeed even to our enemies. We're supposed to love them as well, if you remember. And I've heard some wonderful stories from the fathers here about conversions that take place when agnostics, atheists, even Satanists walk into this place, experience the beauty and majesty of the liturgy and just of the architecture and the art. And it speaks for itself, and it leads them closer to Christ, and in many cases over the threshold into the church herself. Now, I would say that there are three ways of evangelizing. There's evangelizing with the power of the good, there's evangelizing with the power of the true, and there's evangelizing with the power of the beautiful. And of course, these go right back to the ancient Greek philosophers, the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And the good, the true, and the beautiful are actually a manifestation of the Trinity. Because in one sense, they're distinct, like Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and yet you try to separate them at your peril, okay? Because the good is always true and beautiful, the true is always good and beautiful, and the beautiful is always good and true, okay? So they can't be separated, and yet somehow they are distinct. So I'm going to treat the distinction, but I'm making it clear I'm not making the separation. And I think we see, if you like, our Lord himself expressing this mystery of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and evangelizing through the power of the good, the true, and the beautiful in his own words. When he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I see this actually as our Lord's manifesting in his own words that those transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. So, if you like, the way to Christ, I am the way, but the way to him, he is the way to himself, okay? That the way to Christ is the way of goodness. The truth of Christ is the power of reason. And the life of Christ is the power of beauty, which is inseparable from creation and creativity, as I shall go on to explain. So, if you like, the way of goodness, we can evangelize through the power of love, goodness, virtue, evangelize through the power of reason towards the truth, and then evangelize through the way of beauty. I want to say something else before we go any further, though. I think that it's sometimes good, at least entertaining, to introduce the devil into the conversation. So if you're up for a little bit of devil's advocate, hold on just for a second. Here you go. You Catholics. You're absolutely clueless. Even an infant, as soon as an infant learns to count, knows that 3 into 1 don't go, and the whole notion of a Trinity is abject nonsense and counter to all the most basic elements of reason. You're morons. There's only so much devil you can take. Hold on for a second. There we go. See the halo? Just there? It's the little ball spot. That's because the halo's rubbing. It's because my head's too big. I've got a bit more humility and the halo won't rub quite so much. But let's look at this objection to having a mystery such as the Trinity at the heart of our faith. Does it violate reason? I mean, the Catholic Church always insists, right, that fides et ratio, faith and reason, are an indissoluble marriage. They can't be separated. So if this is nonsense, then so is the claim that faith and reason can't be separated. So it's important we get it right. And for me in literature, I'm a literature person, so we're going to get allusions to literature. The most succinct definition of atheism or philosophical materialism I've ever come across is given by Charles Ryder in the novel Brideshead Revisited. How many people here have read Brideshead Revisited? Cultured crowd, I like that. In that novel, and by the way, I would say it's the best example of a film adaptation of a great work of literature ever made is the British television adaptation of Brideshead Revisited, made in the early 1980s with Jeremy Irons as Charles Ryder. And beautiful. But read the book first. That's a golden rule, if you haven't already. But in that book, Brideshead, the house Brideshead, the big manor house in the countryside in England's beautiful historic house, represents the church symbolically. So even the name, right, that Evelyn Moore uses, Brideshead, right? Who's the head of the bride? The bridegroom. You connect the bride and the head together, you get the marriage. The church is both at one and the same time, one flesh, the mystical body of Jesus Christ and the bride of Christ. So Brideshead. And when Charles Ryder, the sort of secular narrator, actually that's not quite true, I've got to be accurate. The story is told by the older Charles Ryder, remembering the younger Charles Ryder. So it's the judgment of a wise man on how stupid he was when he was younger, basically. So as the narrator says, as the young Charles Ryder turns his back on Brideshead for what he thinks will be the last time, he says, henceforth, I will believe only in 3 dimensions, perceived with my 5 senses. Now, 3 dimensions, 5 senses, about as succinct a definition of the encapsulation of philosophical materialism or atheism that you can really come up with. The narrator of that novel, the older Charles Ryder, says immediately afterwards, I have since come to realise that no such world exists. Right? But when he was young, that seemed all there was. But to believe in 3 dimensions is as mystical as believing in a Trinity, in the Holy Trinity. Why? Because the 3 dimensions are a Trinity. That we can only experience the unity, i.e. the oneness of space, through the experience of the threeness of the 3 dimensions. If one of those 3 dimensions were to be removed now, each of us would cease to be and exist. So we live, if you like, in a physical fabric which is itself Trinitarian. And that physical fabric is moving through something transcendental, which we call time, which is also a Trinity. You cannot perceive the reality of time without perceiving simultaneously the past, the present, and the future. You take one of those 3 out of the equation, the whole notion of time collapses. So in other words, even in the physical cosmos, even if you're an atheist, you are confronted with 2 mystical trinities. Now, for a Christian, that's not a problem, right? We believe that God himself is a Trinity, would expect to have those Trinitarian fingerprints smudged over all of creation. So when we do find them smudged over all of creation, we are not surprised. But for the atheist who's going to mock the idea of the Christian understanding of the Holy Trinity, while at the same time embracing 2 very mystical trinities himself as the bedrock of his faith, there's an element of much more of a bigger problem for him. So, trinities. Let's get back to our other mystical trinity, because beyond that those physical trinities, if you like, we have this transcendental trinity of the good, the true, and the beautiful, which I'm going to speak of in terms of love, reason, and beauty. You know, good being virtue, being love, ultimately, and truth being approached through reason, and beauty being beauty. So the first thing about love, and I'm going to explain this really about why evangelizing through beauty is more important perhaps today than it has been, certainly for a long time, at least arguably, because it's difficult to evangelize in the other 2 ways. So the problem with love is that what a Christian understands love being is very different from what the rest of the world understands love being. So for a Christian, love is rational. In other words, love is freely choosing, making a choice, a rational choice, to lay down our lives for the beloved. Now, whether the beloved is God or our spouse or our children or our parents or our enemies, it's a rational choice to lay down our lives for the beloved. And this might affront some of you, but I like that as well, that's good. That love is not a feeling. Right? There are feelings attached to love, and appropriately. But in the philosophical understanding of things, they're accidental. They're not of the essence, they're not substantial. So, obviously, the feelings you have attached to your love for your spouse are not going to be the same feelings as you have as regards your love for your parents or your children or your neighbour or your enemy. Those feelings will change, and appropriately so, right? But that's not the essence of love, because if I have feelings towards my wife and yet behave completely selfishly, I'm not loving her, regardless of the feelings. Because the love is not defined by the feeling, the love is defined by the act. Freely choosing to lay down my life for the beloved. So for a Christian, love is rational. But for the modern world, it's not. It's a feeling. It's defined by the fact that it's a feeling. So if the feeling changes, the love changes. In fact, if the feeling that you call love is no longer there, it's gone. So it's as formless, as shapeless, as ungraspable as a cloud. So we go through life having a succession of transient love affairs, governed by feelings which are irrational. So for the modern world, love is irrational. Don't try to be rational about love, because it's not a rational thing. Well, in that case, it's very difficult to try to evangelize people about love if you're talking about two entirely different things. I would say, however, lest we forget, the most powerful way that we evangelize through the power of love is through becoming saints. And that's easy. I'm not joking. I became a saint on Tuesday. You should try it. It's been great. My life's been so different since I became one. But obviously it's a life work, okay? It's a struggle. It's not easy. But that's what we're called to be. And insofar as we're successful in every step on the way, we are evangelizing just by being who we are, which are people who are in love with Jesus, with his church, and with them, right? Because you're in love with your neighbor, whoever they are, even if they're your enemy. And by the way, just because you think, well, yeah, it is easier said than done. I'm never going to be a saint because I'm a miserable sinner, right? First thing I would say is even the saints were miserable sinners, and if you try to tell them otherwise, they'd put you right. But secondly, there's a paradox of G.K. Chesterton's, which changed my life when I understood it. Now, Chesterton has that ability, with his use of paradox, to change our perception of things. So Chesterton says, if a thing is worth doing at all, it's worth doing badly. Now, when I first read that, I thought, no. My father always taught me if a thing is worth doing at all, it's worth doing well. Now, Chesterton's usually right, but he's wrong here. But then, I had enough humility to think, well, if Chesterton's usually right, perhaps I should at least think that I might possibly be wrong, and perhaps even my father might possibly be wrong. So I went back and looked at it, and of course, the paradox is it's not an either or, it's a both and. And the analogy I use, being English and talking about the only sort of football that there is, I might use the example of someone like Lionel Messi, who plays for Barcelona, arguably the greatest player in the world. When he was 2 years old, he made his parents laugh when he fell over a soccer ball that was half his own size. He was doing it badly. But he continued to do it badly. And the more he did it badly, the more he did it better. Until eventually, in his case at least, he becomes the best soccer player in the world. And of course, what's true of relatively unimportant things like football is true or more important things like the life of faith and trying to become saints, the life of sanctity. So certainly, learning to love by becoming holy is the most important thing we have to do, because the more we succeed in that, the more we'll succeed in all the other aspects of evangelization I'm going to talk about. But that doesn't negate the fact that it's difficult for us to talk about love to our culture, because they don't have the same understanding of what it is we're talking about. So the best way of discussing that love is to be a lover, so they can just see what it is in what you do. Okay, so the second aspect of evangelizing through the power of reason. There's a parallel between evangelizing through love and evangelizing through reason, because they both involve an engagement with the other. Right? To love, you have to choose to lay down your life for the beloved, for the other person, and the act of love, if you like, is the Trinity. Lover, beloved, and the act of loving. But reason's the same thing. In order to reason, you have to engage your mind with that which is outside of it and make sense of it, or try to make sense of it. It's the same process. Right? The mind doing the reasoning, the thing being reasoned upon, and the act of reasoning. It's another Trinity. So what you actually see in these transcendentals is not just a Trinity, but a Trinity of Trinities. And we'll see that when we get to beauty as well in a moment. So just like love, reason leads us to an engagement with the other. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Pilgrim's Regress, how many people have read that? The Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis. I thought there'd be fewer. I can only see one. Two, maybe. Two. But in that book, which I recommend, by the way, it's a formal allegory where Lewis explains his own conversion to Christianity basically through the power of reason. But in that, the everyman character, or the Lewis figure, if you like, called John, is imprisoned by a horrible monster. And that horrible monster is called the spirit of the age. And he can't escape. He's trapped. All this sort of philosophy, propaganda being bombarded him, philosophical materialism. He's nothing but matter, and therefore he doesn't matter. There's a paradox. If you're nothing but matter, you don't matter. But then he's rescued by a beautiful woman in shining armor on a white charger. And her name is Reason. And Reason liberates John from the spirit of the age. And Reason tells him that she has two younger sisters, theology and philosophy. So we see here how reason itself leads us to God, who is, of course, the reason. All reason leads to him because he is the reason. Now, very briefly, other types of evangelizing through the power of reason. We've mentioned philosophy, we've mentioned theology, but history. One of the biggest problems we have in the world today is that the modern world treats the past with contempt. Everybody in the past was a bigot and ignorant because society is somehow mystically progressing towards some golden age in the future, which they idolize, which they visualize. Sometime there will be this golden age when every generation is wiser, better, and smarter than the previous one. That means, of course, you could dismiss the whole of humanity that happened to be born before you were. So therefore, we can evangelize through the power of history. Because insofar as we make history known, we are bringing back into the present the real presence of the past and the lessons that it teaches. So we can evangelize through the power of history, which is a branch of evangelizing through the power of reason. I would say you can evangelize through the power of literature, and that's what I spend most of my time doing. Because as Tolkien says in his famous lecture and essay on fairy stories, that art or story holds up a mirror to man. It shows us ourselves. In that case, in which sense it's very, very realistic. And for those of us that, that perhaps think, well, surely this isn't quite as important, I would say that the answer to that would be to look at the example of Jesus Christ himself. Because God doesn't teach us the deepest truths about himself by handing down a philosophy. It's not a set of philosophical rules. God teaches us lessons about himself, first of all, in the story he tells. If you like, his story is history. God becomes man. He lives, he dies, he's resurrected, he's ascended into heaven. God shows us himself through his life story. Not just a set of rules, it's not an abstract concept. It's a concrete reality. A human person, fully God and fully human, who becomes incarnate, enters the story, lives in the story, and shows us through his story how our story should reflect his. So God himself chooses the modus operandi, if you like, of the story to teach lessons. And even within that story, how does Christ teach many of his most important lessons? Apart from the story that he is living, it's the story that he is telling. Most of his most powerful lessons were taught in forms of stories, parables. God is a storyteller, both in who he is and what he says. This is Christ's own sanctification of the power of story. So, for instance, it should not be too controversial for me to say to you that in one sense you are more real than the prodigal son. Because you really do exist as flesh and blood in time, with a soul made in the image of God. The prodigal son never existed. The prodigal son is a figment of our Lord's imagination. The prodigal son is a story that our Lord tells. The prodigal son never existed. His father never existed. His brother never existed. Even the pigs never existed. But every single time that story has been told, since it was first told, it speaks to each of us with a power that transcends any other individual person we might have met in life. Because when we hear the story of the prodigal son, we see ourselves mirrored in it. He is showing us a mirror to ourselves, which is what all good literature should do. We're seeing something of the prodigal son. Perhaps, please God, sometimes something of the forgiving parent. Perhaps something of the envious sibling. Right? So we can say, when people had a better, broader understanding of education, theology was the queen of the sciences. Theology is a science because it's a branch of knowledge, a path of reason. Philosophy is a science. Now, I would say, using the same argument, history is a science and literature is a science. They're all branches of knowledge. But science is understood in the Catholic understanding of the word, Catholic big C and Catholic small c. And a universal understanding that knowledge comes in many forms, and as long as the knowledge is leading us to the truth, it's a branch of scientia, a branch of knowledge. It was only the Enlightenment, by the way, that threw out everything that wasn't purely empirical and materialistic and called it something other than science, other than knowledge. All right, let's move on then now to evangelizing through the power of beauty, which we've already touched upon. Because if God, of course, is love, and God is reason, God is also beauty. He's not only the most beautiful thing there is, all beauty comes from him, and all beauty leads back to him. Beauty is also Trinitarian. Because just as love is laying down our life for the other, and reason is our mind engaging with the other, so beauty is the experience of the order and harmony of the other. And the thing I'm going to argue, and I'm guessing that St. John Cassius doesn't need arguing as much as it does in other places, such as that ugly church on the West Coast, that it's a danger, and I would even say a heresy, to treat beauty as an optional extra, an add-on. Yeah, of course you have to have love, goes without saying. Yeah, of course you have to have reason, goes without saying. But, beauty is like a trailer. You've got the car, love and reason, and you can tag the beauty along if you have time, if you're so minded. It's not really essential. Well, if, as I'm arguing, that the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful are a manifestation of the Trinity, that's actually heretical, right? You have God the Father and God the Son, but we can forget that Holy Spirit stuff, right? So, if you like, love can be seen as the apologetics of virtue, that which overcomes the power of narcissism. Reason is the apologetics of scientia, the apologetics of reason, of knowledge, that overcomes the power of relativism. Beauty is the apologetics of creation. And it requires, as St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us, humility. To see beauty or to do something creative or beautiful well requires humility. And again, I'm going back to the Summa Theologically here, it's St. Thomas. Because the path of perception, so this doesn't even apply only to beauty, it also applies to love and to reason. The path of perception needs to begin with humility, because it's humility that opens the eyes of wonder. And it's only after the eyes are open to wonder that we are given the gift of contemplation. And it's only once we have that gift of contemplation that our mind and soul can have what St. Thomas calls dilatatio, dilation, the opening up of the mind and the soul and the heart to the fullness of what is real and what is there, to be able to see it. I mean, it's no coincidence, by the way, that the enemies ranged against Christendom, at least some of the enemies ranged against Christendom, go under the banner of pride. Because pride is that which destroys humility. It's the absence of humility. And without humility, you do not have wonder. And therefore, the truth, in terms of love, reason, or beauty, become unattainable for you. So without humility, we're all in big trouble. And that, of course, shouldn't surprise us, because that's right at the beginning, okay? The choice of Satan to choose pride over humility leads to his fall. The choice of Adam and Eve to listen to the temptation of Satan to follow pride rather than humility leads to the fall. So this is at the very source and heart of our understanding of what it is to be human. Humility is the beginning of everything else. The absence of it is the end of everything else. All right, now I'm going to spend the rest of the talk, next 10 or 15 minutes or so, talking about aspects of the apologetics of beauty, evangelizing through the power of beauty, or the apologetics of creation. I'm going to begin with Chesterton. And one of Chesterton's most important books is a book called The Everlasting Man. Who's here has read The Everlasting Man? A number, that's good, it's good. See, I've been a college professor for too long. It's impossible for me to give a talk without asking for a show of hands on things. So I apologize, I suppose, for that. It's interesting for me to know, what people know in the audience. So anyway, that book is divided into two parts. The first part begins with the man in the cave. The second part begins with the God in the cave, i.e. the stable in Bethlehem. But the first part, the God in the cave, this blew me away when I first read it. And I was before my conversion. I was the angry young man that Father alluded to in his introduction. And by the grace of God, I started reading Chesterton. And he said, if you listen to the modern experts, the modern scientists about our ancient ancestors, you'd have an idea that basically Stone Age man was a brute, not much better than the beasts. And that basically he dragged his wife around by the hair. And that when he got tired of his wife, he hit her over the head with a club and got himself a new wife, who he then proceeded to drag around by the hair. Because that's all we were, right? That's who we really are, deep down. That's what we are, cavemen, all right? And so Chesterton said, well, okay, let's be a bit scientific about this, science. Let's do something really radical, like let's walk into the cave and look at the evidence. He said, when you go into the cave, he said, do you find a pile of female skulls piled up in the corner, all neatly cracked like eggs? He says, no. He said, when you go in the cave, what you find is art. You find art on the walls. And Chesterton, who was trained as an artist before he became a writer, and not just art, he says, but good art. There's a sense of movement of the animals, and the swing of the head of the beast being pursued by the hunters has that sense of the flow of the artist's hand and the sweep of the movement. In other words, when you go back as far as you could possibly go in the hunt for our own selves, for our own ancestors, you find something which separates us from all of the rest of the animal species. Art. So what is art? Well, art is a manifestation of the divine image in us. We know we're made in God's image in a way that other things aren't. I mean, in some sense, of course, and this isn't heretical, in some sense, of course, the whole of creation is made in God's image because he made it, right? A tree, an oak tree, came from the mind of God. So in one sense, everything is made in God's image. He's the creator of it. But we're made in God's image in a different, deeper, more divine way. We possess certain things that those other things that God's created don't possess. And that's what we mean when we talk about the divine image in us, being made in God's image. One is the ability to love. One is the ability to put instinct to one side and freely choose to die for someone else. Which all love is, by the way. You don't have to physically perish by being killed, but you do have to die. Love is impossible without death. You have to die to yourself, lay down your life for the beloved. We can freely choose to do that because that's what God does. It's God's image in us when we choose to love. We are loving as God loves. And again, reason. The Greeks, one of the words that the word the Greek had for man was anthropos, where we get words like anthropology. Anthropos means he who turns upwards, he who looks up. In other words, he who is beyond mere instinct. Now, I sometimes say that the animal grazes, but man gazes. So we can look up and we can see the stars. A cow doesn't see the stars. A dog doesn't see the stars. And when we see the stars, if we have humility, we wonder. And we move to contemplation. And our heart and mind dilates into the fullness of the majesty of God's presence in his cosmos. Reason. Being able to get beyond our instinctive selves to something which makes us part of something else, something bigger. As I say to my students as well, I think it's in The Everlasting Man. It might be orthodoxy. Actually, I think it's in orthodoxy in the chapter on the ethics of Elfland that Chesterton complains about the modern world, saying we're irrelevant because look at the size of the cosmos, look how small you are. Look at the size of our sun, look how small you are. Look how far the furthest, even the nearest galaxy is. compared with how small you are. You are nothing. Get used to the idea. And I say to my students, well, there is a sense, of course, in which you are bigger. Each of us as individuals is bigger than all the stars put together. Because we can look at the stars and the stars can't look at us. The stars are just large bits of inanimate matter. They're not any bigger in terms of being than a grain of sand. We can see them, we can write poetry about them, we can measure how far away, we can do science, we can do physics, we can do metaphysics with them. All right, so apologetics of creation. I'll say one thing, by the way, about art. We talk about Stone Age before we do anything else. Play devil's advocate again. I can't bother to put the horns on. You can imagine that they're there. Well, what about bad art? What about bad art? I mean, you say art's good, but there's a lot of ugly art out there. There's a lot of art that's leading people astray. There's a lot of art that, quite frankly, is diabolical. How does that fit into this scheme of things? Well, I sometimes say that there are 4 types of art. There's good art. There's good, bad art. There's bad, good art. And there's bad, bad art. By which I mean that obviously I'm using 2 different things there. Good in terms of the amount of talent that's there. So something can be good as art because the artist has a great deal of talent, but bad as morals. Good, bad art. Or it can be someone who has impeccable morals but has no talent. All right? So bad, good art. And it can be bad, bad art. Forget about that. All right? So the best art, of course, is good art, where someone has 5 talents, have been given 5 talents by God. And they use those 5 talents to the glory of God, because all art should be giving back to the giver of the gift given. But what about those people given 5 talents and prefer to cast those talents before swine rather than give them as gifts back to the person that gave the gift to them in the first place? What about that sort of art? Isn't that a problem for our position? Well, I would argue then that God freely gives us the gifts that he gives. We have a responsibility to use those gifts virtuously. But God is a lover, which means he's not a rapist. When he gives us gifts, he doesn't force us to use them in the way that he knows would be good. Because in order to do that, he would take away the gift of love, because if we can't freely choose to lay down our life for the beloved, we can't love at all. It's impossible to love. So the price, if you like, of that freedom to love is freedom to abuse. And the analogy would be the gift of life. God freely gives all of us the gift of life. And we have different talents, different gifts. But we're all given the gift of life. If God took away the gift of life the first time we abused it, I'd be the only person here. None of us would be here. In fact, the only person who would be here actually is Our Lady of Victory would still be here, right? But the rest of us wouldn't be here. In other words, God does not take away a gift when we abuse it. And what's true of the gift of life is true of the gift of creativity. Of course, there might be a price to pay when we die. If God gave us 5 talents to use, and we spent the whole of our life abusing them, there might literally be all hell to pay. But nonetheless, he's not going to remove the gift. So why the power of beauty? So I mean, this church would actually serve the same function as the sunrise I'm going to talk about now. Because I think the metaphor, the analogy for the apologetics of creation, the apologetics of creativity, the evangelizing power of beauty is summarized this way. You take a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, and an atheist, and you sit them down in the middle of a field in the middle of the night, but you face them east. An hour or so later, when the sun starts to rise, there's a beautiful work of art being presented before their eyes. Perhaps when the sun first starts to rise, they can actually look at it. I wrote a poem once called Solstice Sunrise. It's actually a real occasion. Midsummer in England, it gets light about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was living in the countryside and I was out. There's nothing, just a hair, nothing else. And then I saw the sunrise and I could look directly at it. It was like the host rising at mass, white, resplendent. And then the color of it changes from white to gold, white to red. And you can still look at it. And eventually it changes to gold, and you can't look at it any longer in its glory. And while this is happening, the reds and the pinks are flowing out across the clouds and across the skyline. It's one of the most majestic works of art I've ever seen. And it's given to all of us most days of the year. Most of us don't bother to look. So imagine these people, the Protestant, the Catholic, the Muslim, and the atheist, facing east, and they see that happening. Now, regardless of what separates them in terms of reason, their apprehension and misapprehension of reality, they are going to experience that beauty, and they're going to be moved by it. They're going to be edified by it. In other words, they're going to be lifted up. And when you have that experience of edification, there's an inescapable psychological response, which is a sense of gratitude. It's good that we're here. It's good that we've seen this together. And then the inevitable consequence of that sense of gratitude is to start asking basic questions like, well, who do I thank? I'm grateful. I want to thank someone or something. Who do I thank? So you start to ask the most basic, fundamental questions once you experience wonder and the gratitude that it leads to. However, let's do the same scenario again. How many people here have read The Lord of the Rings or seen the movies? Right. We have in the field, in the dark, facing east, the Catholic, the Protestant, the Muslim, the atheist, and Gollum. When the sun rises, all the others are looking at it in some sense of awe and appreciation and gratitude. Gollum runs for cover, looking for the shadow, looking for the darkness. In other words, that even beauty cannot reach a soul that's shriveled through the addiction to sin. In other words, a soul that's so dark through its own pride that it only actually desires the thing to which it is addicted, whichever sin or sins that is. And one of the great ironies of our world, of course, is that those people become slaves because, of course, what is a definition of addiction? Addiction is slavery, right? Slavery to a habit or a thing. We are being taught in this culture to become addicts in the name of freedom. To become slaves in the name of freedom. Of course, in those people, and it could be that, that some people are unreachable by the power of love, reason, or beauty. But I speak now as someone who has been to prison twice for hate crimes. And I was touched by God, by Christ, moved to prayer. So even Gollum is not beyond the reach of the love of God. And as we are the agents of the love of God, they shouldn't be beyond our reach either, although they are a challenge. So I'm going to finish just by giving some examples of the power of the apologetics of creation. Oh no, one other thing. There's one other thing I want to talk about briefly. Tolkien talks in terms, he doesn't use this terminology, it's the terminology I use, but this is taken from Tolkien's, what I call Tolkien's philosophy of myth, or Tolkien's philosophy of creativity. Tolkien used the word myth, by the way, as meaning story, not lie. Right? There's like that word love, all right? And you've got to understand what he means. When he says myth, he means story, the philosophy of story. And he says that there's basically a hierarchy of creative value. At the top, you have the creator. Below the creator, you have the things made directly by the creator. Creation. Those things brought into being ex nihilo, from nothing, by the creator. Below creation, you have what Tolkien calls subcreation. That's what we do, using the power of the divine image of imagination, using our imagination and creative gifts, we bring things into being from other things that already exist. We can't bring things into being ex nihilo, from nothing. That's divine power. But a landscape artist, for instance, will take a canvas, oil or watercolor paints, his hands, his eyes, the sunrise, the light, the buildings, the animals, all those things that exist already. He will use his creative gifts of imagination, the divine image in him, to bring something new, a new work of subcreation, a new work of art into being. So then Tolkien says basically, so you have the creator at the top, creation beneath that, and then subcreation or art. And he said that, but there's two types of art. There's subcreation to the glory of God, and there's subcreation for the utility of man, what we might call technology. I was giving a talk once, I can't remember what the subject of the talk was, but I talked about this hierarchy of creative value. And it was in Lisbon, in Portugal. And I got to this part, creator, creation, subcreation of the glory of God, and subcreation for the use of man, technology. And they all started looking at each other and nudging each other and smirking, the audience, and chuckling. And I thought, well, that's fine if you just told a joke, right? You want people to laugh if you've just told a joke. But everyone starts laughing when you just made a serious point. You think, well, what's happened here, right? So I stopped my talk and asked, I said, well, what's so funny? And I said, well, you've talked about that hierarchy, and this is an engineering school. So in other words, you just consigned us to the bottom of the pile, okay? And I said to them, but this hierarchy, none of it's bad. There's not a hierarchy of bad things, there's a hierarchy of good things. Of course we have to have a house to live in, clothes to wear, the means to be able to get through life. Technology, used well, is a good thing. There's art, a good art. You can have bad art, you have bad technology, but technology itself is good. But we need to get that hierarchy, because ultimately we are called, as I've said, to give the gift that we're given back to the giver of the gift. So even if you are an engineer, you should be doing it to the glory of God. And obviously not being involved in engineering anything which is going to be inherently sinful. Any more than if you're an artist, you don't produce immoral art. Now, there is, however, a way in which we can even make God's creation better. And this now he said, all right, he's been doing well for 45 minutes and now he's committed the heresy. Because surely if God's brought something into being, it's perfect, right? It's what it's supposed to be. If something's what it's supposed to be, how can you make it better? Well, I'll tell you a story. God made this beautiful stone. And it's perfect. It's what it's meant to be as a stone. But this stone is buried under the ground so no one can see it. And using subcreativity for the use of man, in other words, technology, we dug the stone up so we could see it. More than that, someone took the stone and started doing things with it. And that stone, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, is on the right as you walk through the door. It's Michelangelo's Pieta, with the Holy Mother of God cradling her dead son in her arms. That if we cooperate using our divine gifts of imagination with the glory of God's creation, we can even make that creation more glorious. And this church is itself a manifestation of that. So I'm going to finish just with a few quick examples of the power of evangelizing through the power of beauty. Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. It's not a movie, it's a moving icon. And when I went to see that when it first came out, I saw it, came out of the movie theatre, got in the car. I never ever turn the radio on. I normally listen to music in the car. But for some reason this particular day, one of the 100 times, and that's not an exaggeration, I never listened to the radio, but something prompted me to turn the radio on. And I have no idea why, because I never ever listened to this particular station. That the first radio station I came upon was a Protestant talk show. And the Protestant talk show, they were discussing Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. And they were saying, I'd never realized how important Mary was, knowing the life and passion of Jesus, until I saw that film. And a part of me was thinking, not the best part of me, duh, right? But the point is that ever since the Reformation, the best Catholic theologians have been trying to show the Protestants the importance of the role of the Blessed Virgin in salvation history, with very limited success. Mel Gibson produces a work of art, a moving icon, and they get it. And I don't know, but maybe it's part of the beatific vision, maybe I will know one day, how many Protestants came into the Catholic Church as a direct or indirect result of seeing that movie. We have C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And we have The Lord of the Rings. I give a whole other talk on The Lord of the Rings. You could buy it. It's actually the first commercial break. See, it doesn't seem appropriate to have a commercial break in a talk about beauty, does it? But I do know that you Americans are very uncomfortable unless you do get at least one commercial break. So that just do remember that my book table over there is the talk I give on The Lord of the Rings, on the Catholicism of The Lord of the Rings, is one of the CDs for sale there. And I think Father did say to me, I think Father Joshua, you can blame him for this, Father Joshua did say to me that just for the next half an hour, there's a plenary indulgence for all people at this talk, where the cardinal virtues of prudence and temperance do not apply, and you need to spend more money than you can afford at the book table, and for that you'll get 5,000 years off of purgatory. Is that right, Father? Yeah, he's nodding. Do you see that? He's nodding. So I won't have time now to talk about the Catholicism of the Lord of the Rings, but what I would say is that, to quote Tolkien verbatim here, Tolkien said, quote, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work." And I've written books, and it's manifold and manifest. But you have to check that out for yourself. But the reason I'm mentioning that, the best-selling books of all time, the best-selling works of literature of all time. At number 1 is Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes. At number 2 is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. At number 3 is The Lord of the Rings. At number 6 is The Hobbit. At number 11 is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So in other words, 3 of the top 11 books were written by 2 men that were best of friends at Oxford in the middle of the 20th century, who preached and practiced this evangelizing power of beauty in a way that's changed the world. I do want to say one other thing about that, by the way, just to show them I'm a Tolkien nerd. I sometimes say, and for those of Spanish background here, I'm saying it tongue-in-cheek, right? But I sometimes say that the reason that Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes is the best-selling book of all time is that the Spanish only ever wrote one book. I know it's not true, it's more a manifestation of my ignorance of Spanish literature than anything else, right? But the point is, it's been around for 400 years. It is the preeminent work of Spanish literature, and every single Spanish-speaking child has been made to buy that book. It's required reading, right, at high school level. So of course, for 400 years, of course it's the best-selling book ever. Big deal. A Tale of Two Cities. I'm sure 90% of the people that have read The Tale of Two Cities or bought it did so because they had to. Required text at high school or college. Now, which Charles Dickens book are you going to read? It's going to be A Tale of Two Cities, right? They lack imagination. Lord of the Rings, never taught at college. It's only been around for 60 years, not 400. It's third in the list of all-time bestsellers because people chose to buy it, because they wanted to read it. So for me, to all intents and purposes, it is the best-selling and most popular work of literature of all time. And as Tolkien said, it is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, manifesting in itself the evangelizing power of beauty. So go forth and make disciples of the world, evangelizing with the power of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Thank you. I broke one of the golden rules of standing in front of people. Leave them wanting more. I talked for about 15 minutes longer than I planned, so I apologise. But maybe 5 minutes for questions still, and then if anybody has any other questions after that, I'll be over at my book table and come and ask me there. So any questions?
Yeah, when you talked about how a Christian understands love and how the world understands it differently, can you talk about how a Christian understands hate and the world understands hate right now?
Yes, I mean, hatred is the antithesis of love. So hatred is never permissible for a Christian. I was discussing with the fathers yesterday that I think that the one, should we say emotion, if that's the right word, or the one action of our Lord that we should never try to emulate is his righteous anger with the money changers. I think only God can handle anger and remain charitable. So if you find that you're becoming angry about things, find a way of becoming less angry about them, not by becoming sinful, but by finding ways of countering hatred and sin with love, and the peace and serenity that comes as a consequence of love.
Intrigued by your reference to humility as one of the components of the artistic process. And I am wondering if there's some kind of way that you could tie that to the thing that we always pray for in the joyful mysteries, and which I have never understood, Mary's humility. And we ask for the virtue of humility on that first mystery. Can Our Lady help us be better artists by imitating? Can you tie that together for me?
Absolutely. And that poem I talked about, Solstice Sunrise, I actually relate the white of the sun rising like the Eucharist to the joyful mysteries, the red to the sorrowful mysteries, and the gold of the sun as it rises to the glorious mysteries. So actually the rising of the sun goes through the 15 mysteries of the Rosary. But of course, Our Lady is the way that we are meant to perfectly respond to God's gifts. I mean, the ultimate creativity, if you like, was the Incarnation. And it took Our Lady's humility and her fiat, her agreement, to, if you like, to radically change her life in order to do the will of God. And I think that is a model for all of us, and that we have to realize that comes at a price, and it's a price we should be prepared to pay. And that's true of artists, it's true of, well, we're all artists, we all have gifts. Whatever gifts we're given, it's true of the way we're meant to be using them, as Our Lady used them.
I was interested to hear what your take is on the role of the internet in evangelizing through, beauty, through art, through literature, bringing people closer to God, because with the tap of a phone, we have access to the most sublime, majestic achievements, of mankind, but in the same moment, we have access to some of the most depraved things you could possibly find, and anyone can do that. And I mean, what role do you think the internet has in that? Like, has it been a benefit for us or a negative?
Well, the first thing I would say is I'd refer you to an article I wrote that you can find online, and I think if you just put the title in, you should be able to find it. And the title of the article is "Distracting Ourselves to Death." Now, I'm certainly not saying people should not use the internet. I mean, I use it myself, obviously. I am saying we should find more time unplugged, find more time for silence, for prayer. I actually advocate as a major spiritual exercise to make yourself healthier, to take up the reading of poetry, because poetry forces you to slow down. You can't read poetry quickly. If you're trying to read it quickly and you don't get it, it's because you're reading it too quickly, not because there's something wrong with the poetry, or unless it's bad poetry. But I mean, you can know you're reading good poetry. You can make the right selections there. So we need to actually find ourselves in the presence of reality, and that means less time than most of us spend with virtual reality. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I need to say more than that. Of course, we have the internet's somewhere where we have to be fighting. It's a front line of evangelization. Of course, we have to have a presence on the internet. We have to have the good, the true, and the beautiful there for people to see. So we have to engage, but we have to disengage. And we also have to realize that many of us are more addicted to the power of technology than we realize. And I would ask perhaps in the coming Advent season and the following Lent season to try to give up some of the things that we do every day on the internet. And if we can't do it, we've got a problem.
So I really loved how you talked about good art, bad good art, and all of that. So something that I'm interested to hear your take on is, which do you think is worse? Good bad art or bad art?
You mean bad good art? Bad art's just bad. Yeah. Good bad or bad good?
Actually, because for instance, like rap music or something, you could probably say that that's bad art, you know?
I'd have no problem with that. Some people
Or, you know, for example, so actually bad and good bad, so.
Well, I think there's an element of chalk and cheese, actually, because, someone might have beautiful morals and feel that they're writing a beautiful story or painting a beautiful painting or composing a beautiful piece of music or a wonderful song, but they don't have 5 talents, they have 1 talent. Now, so, insofar as there's a morality in it, it's a trite, shallow, not very beautiful reality. So it's not going to do you any harm, but it's not really going to take you very far either. But the danger of the other sort of art, if it's 5 talents used well, in the sense of used artistically, artfully, should we say, is you have a very powerful work of art. And that very powerful work of art can move people very powerfully. And if the people can be moved very powerfully in the wrong direction, then it's perilous. So I suppose the answer would be that a bad good work of art, in other words, good as morals, bad as art, is harmless, right? Whereas a good bad work of art is potentially very, very dangerous, deadly. So we do have to be have the power of discernment as to which good art we actually spend time engaging with. Thank you so much, everybody. God bless.